Well, good morning, gents. Welcome once again to our study. Now we can get going. Welcome once again to our study, One Man's Journey. And let's turn to, let's turn to Genesis chapter 30, 1 through 6. We're going to read that here in just a moment. That's going to be the supportive text of what we'll be looking at this morning from the book of Genesis, chapter 49. So, but I want to read the birth account of Dan, who is our subject this morning, Jacob's son Dan. So we've seen this slide many times. Last week, just tying this in, referring back, we looked at the blessing to Issachar, and we remember we talked a lot about Jacob's words, Issachar is a strong donkey. We spent some time talking about that. The donkey finds a pleasant land and lays down and rests, digging in, occupies. And what we built out of that was this idea of identity. We had a hard time finding texts that would support the idea or inform the idea, the blessing. And so I just derived the idea that the strong donkey was an animal that could do work, real work. And Issachar was that, according to the blessing, was to be that donkey. And we talked about the male tendency to gain identity through what we can produce with our hands, work. And where we ended last week was our tables discussions with this little activity that I put together. And based on our discussions last week about how we derive our identity, our natural tendency as male is to derive our identity by what we can produce, who we know, or what we own. And so I had each of us, each of you had an opportunity to say, if this is me, the me, to what percent where do I derive my identity as me, as a person? And we went through that last week, and I hope you had some fun with that at your table. I had several comments afterwards about that. So most of them were positive. So anyway, now this week we're going to look at Dan, and from the screen it reads, I know you guys aren't there, so Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Interesting saying. Or interesting verse rather. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a horned snake in the path, that bites the horse's heels, so that his rider falls backwards. Wow, what on earth does this mean? This is so interesting to see. The last words of a father to his son last week is Issachar is a strong donkey. Notice there's the animal. There's several that are correlated to animals. We might summarize those as we continue. But this week, Dan is a judge. And of course, that's going to tie back with the text we're going to read in just a moment, his birth background. And then secondly, Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a snake. And so we're going to look at that. How is Dan, the person Dan, or the tribe of Dan, or, as we've learned, possibly the nation of Israel, which encompasses the tribe of Dan, how are these like a serpent? So, interesting question. We're going to look at that. So, the birth background here is where we like you guys to read this. Would somebody read chapter 30, 1 through 6, and this is the birth background to the son Dan.
When Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister. she said to Jacob, "Give me children or I'll die." Jacob became angry with her and said, "Am I in the place of God, who has kept you from having children?" Then she said, "Here is Bilhah, my servant. Sleep with her so that she can bear children for me, and I too can build a family through her." So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife. Jacob slept with her, and she became pregnant and bore him a son. Then Rachel said, "God has vindicated me. He has listened to my plea and given me a son." Because of this, she named him Dan.
Okay. And the idea of vindication is core to the name Dan. Those two correlations. Judgment, vindication. Now, I put a note here. I'm not sure you can read that note. Yes. But it says, the name Dan in Hebrew means, oh, here it is, vindicated or judge. He is the fifth son in birth order. Number 7 in the order of blessing. But the first son of Rachel. We have, up to this point, we've just been looking at the sons of Leah. But now this Dan represents the first son of Rachel, although not through natural birth, via her handmaid Bilhah. Okay, so that's where that is where we are. Rachel's handmaid. Now, at first reading of this text, what are some observations? What are some things that struck you about this birth background? Such is life. Complicated, yes.
We can't culturally relate to the acceptable standard of a child.
A social, familial structure.
Right.
Right, yeah. Right. And so we can't relate to that, but what are possibly some components we can relate to within this very brief story? Some things that maybe perked your interest a little bit. Can you think of anything? Yeah, Art?
Rachel knew that she was the chosen wife, not the chosen in quotes,
Yeah.
but barren, and she thought it was Jacob's fault, and thus she was jealous, as the text says.
Right.
So I think she was mad. Said, "Give me kids."
Right.
And Jacob said, "Not my fault."
Yeah. Doing my best.
Yeah. So she said, "All right, how can I be sneaky and still have kids?"
Good. Yes.
It's
She-
ironic that she later died in childbirth.
Yes.
I mean,
That's interesting.
why, you know,
Huh.
God's plan, it is confusing.
Yeah. Actually, but that's a great observation, Charlie. Here she was angry about not bearing, but years later she dies in childbearing. You know, that's something, that's a tension. I'm going to hold that one in my head for a while as we go through this, because I think that's a very good observation. All right, a few things there, and let's go a little bit further. There have been multiple attempts to connect. You know, as I've been looking at other commentators, and I haven't looked, you know, I don't spend a lot of time looking at others, but I do look at others and you know, see what they say. And there's a broad range of what other men and women have thought about in relation to this, and they're all valid. You know, who's to judge what is. You know, some are better than others. You know, as far as when I would say better, I would rate that as far as some sort of support rather than just pulling it out of midair. But attempts to connect. You know, we're trying to take this occasion around their father's hospice bed. We're trying, and these last words spoken, which have to have meaning, last words spoken meaning, and we're trying to connect it. What is it? God, what does it mean? And there's a lot of mystery that we've been discovering, but it sure is fun. I love this kind of stuff. So, the life of, so some have connected, correlated this with Samson. Samson is the most famous Danite. You know, out of Judges, the book of Judges, the judge Samson was from the tribe of Dan, and Judges 13 through 16. So some have said, well, this is obviously not so obvious to me, but this idea of the snake striking, putting the rider, the strong rider, backwards and unstable on his horse, striking the horse's heel, is Samson. Coming from a relatively small, insignificant tribe, Samson came forward and saved the day as a judge of Israel. And in that way, he demonstrates this blessing. So that you know, okay. Another idea that I read was as a tribe. Now this is correlating the blessing to a later Danite, an individual. This is correlating the blessing to the tribe of Dan. And in this case, the tribe of Dan, which their allocation, their geographic allocation was here. This would be the northern section of the coastal plains, which is fertile and good farmland, right by the very moderate temperature. These areas would great. You've seen it recently, and they were forced out of their area. And Judges 18 talks about how they were forced out of this area by the Philistines, because the Philistines occupied this area, and they were a smaller, insignificant, relatively insignificant tribe. And they later migrated to way north to a little town called Laish. Judges 18 talks about Laish and how Dan went in and sacked the town and took the town over and renamed it Dan. And Dan, the town Dan, represents generally the most northern point in the allocated land of Israel, and thus came the term from Dan to Beersheba. You know, Dan being at the north, Beersheba being to the south. That when you see that phrase, it meant from all-encompassing Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, or Beersheba. And so there is where that came in. Now individual, tribal. These are attempts to understand this. Nothing really hit me yet in this whole thing. So I'm going back now to the text. And in the text that we read in Genesis 49, there are two key ideas, two central ideas. One is vindication through the naming of Dan, and the second is this idea of small having big impact. Small animal, big bite. You know, small animal, big bite. A small entity having the effect on something large like a horse. You know, that's the idea. So those are two key ideas that I muddled around. And so here's the first. Idea one is vindication, and I'm tying this back to the birth narrative in Genesis 30, where we see a flow. I created a flow, a diagram of what I see here in Rachel's activity that Dave read to us. First of all, there is Rachel's envy. She's jealous. She, as a woman, wants to be able to give birth, and she's jealous of her sister Rachel, although, as Arthur has said, she knows she is the favored wife. But that isn't good enough. She's got to, it's again going to identity. She is now barren. and she wants, oh, she's got to have a child. And so she starts, like all human beings start, to lash out and find something to attach her pain to. And in this case, it's her husband. It is your fault. And of course, that creates anger in Jacob. But he goes ahead and follows through. She devises a plan. If I am barren, I need to now take matters into my own hands and make it happen. Okay? Because I am in pain. So her envy leads to an action. An action is this plan to now bring in a subcontractor. Just thought of that. And then and so she has this plan, and Jacob agrees with this plan. He creates the stud service, and the stated outcome is the birth of this young boy, the birth and stated outcome. But what I find fascinating and so correlating to human nature is that once she devises this plan and takes matters into her own hands and watches the outcome, she takes the result of that outcome and says, yep, didn't I tell you? God's on my side. Now, how many times have you seen that? Oh my goodness. Oh, jeez. Millions of times throughout all of history. What has been connected with God's blessing through my own activity? Oh my goodness, some atrocities that have occurred. Well, obviously the outcome dictates, and we are right. God is on our side. God is on our side. This is, God has vindicated me through my plan because I now have this son. Now there's where we can correlate. We can't correlate to the the immediate story, but guys, I hope there's some degree of reality and correlation in your minds of where possibly someone who looks a lot like you has pulled this one off. You can't remember their name, but I know it's true of me. We'll take matters in our own hands, and yet God is on our side. So Rachel's envy, Rachel's action, the stated outcome within the text, and of course then we attach the stated outcome. Yep, told you so. God is on our side. So there you go. There's idea one, vindication. What that has to do with the future of Dan, I haven't made that correlation. I'm just taking the birth story and taking what, and this course creates the context of which Dan was raised in. Just like remember we looked at the birth context of the other, for every one of the sons, we're looking at the birth context to see how their birth affects their actions later on. I cannot make any correlation to Dan's immediate actions later on, but certainly it's true about the birth context itself. So again, I took this idea to yet another slide. Going nowhere. I've got here, how in the world did what was I thinking? I passed over that this morning. Rachel's envy, Rachel's action, stated outcome, and this result. And I guess my thinking when I put this together a few days ago, again, I didn't really concentrate on this morning, but I think my thinking was at that time is that this is a cycle, a flow that really goes nowhere. This takes us nowhere. We think we're going somewhere. Oh, God has vindicated me. And in reality, it's just rearranging the furniture. And there's really no growth as a person. There is really no blessing outcome. It's just a matter of what our propensity in human nature is to be right. I've got to be right. And guys, it leads us to nowhere. There's the point. So here's the second idea that again we're making attempts to connect this blessing to a man, a tribe, and a nation. A man, a tribe, and a nation. And the second idea here is this small serpent, big bite. Okay, so this is true of Israel as a nation within our lifetime. So, you know, our idea is we all live at a certain point in time, and the Bible transcends that, obviously. And so the truth in the Scripture. And so what we naturally do as human beings is we take those Scriptures and we're trying to correlate them to our little tiny context that we live in. So within our context, it is true that Israel is like a serpent. Israel as a nation is like a serpent. And in what regard? So politically, much of the world, this idea of small having big bite.
How true that is today.
Yeah, and that's, yeah.
Israel.
Israel as a nation, first of all, politically, much, I've got here stated, much of the world's governmental decision-making strategies, the world's governmental decision-making strategies has to do with Israel. What do we do with Israel? You know, and you take their geographical footprint and correlate to the amount of thought and decision-making strategy that goes into that geographical footprint, it's way out of scale. I mean, as far as for such a small area, landmass, to have such an amount of thought and consideration to be centered around that is really quite remarkable. And there is no other like that. There is no other nation, I would be safe to say, or in our lifetime. And I would say, if we look at history, Israel as a landmass, as an area, has had so much conflict. I would say this area has had the most, by far, the most amount of conflict centered around this area is more than any other place on the face of the planet. I mean, if you look at it. So, anyway, again, small, and the reason is it has big bite. It has impact. It has big ramifications. Whatever, you know, however you would cast that, it's very small, but it's very significant. So politically, I think it's true. And then secondly, militarily, this is true. And I went on the internet. I used to know stories of, I read a lot about Israel about 30 years ago, more than that now, when we were headed over there. There's all kinds of stories on how militarily the small Israel, it's generally through some small and an amazing happenstance that a very large impact takes place militarily. I didn't pull up any stories this time, but there are many stories of, like during the 6-Day War in 1976. If you read O Jerusalem, I've never read that book, but I understand there's all kinds of stories in there of these miraculous, how this small unarmed group had just, we would call it intervention, divine intervention, to bring a victory. And
David and Goliath.
Well, yeah, to David and Goliath. Over many stories. I don't think just a handful, but there are many stories where militarily the large, the small meets the large. Well, I started going out and doing a little research, and I found this really interesting news clip of which actually involves a snake. and of course Dan as the snake. So I wanted to play this because I think you'll get a kick out of it. So we'll see if we can get this to play.
We looked really hard to find the coolest gadget we could find today. Roll this thing. It's a spying robo-snake used right now on a testing basis in Israel with an all-seeing eye that can record video and sound as it snakes its way through enemy territory, like that plot of green grass on your screen.
This looks like a kid's toy. I cannot believe this is real.
Check it out. Now, Ward Carroll is our friend, editor of military.com. How you doing, Ward? Good morning to you.
Hi, Bill.
We love seeing you, but I really want to see the snake, guys. Roll the videotape and tell me how this thing moves, Ward.
Well, it moves just like a real snake. It can either coil and uncoil or undulate up and down based on how it needs to go. But as you see in the video there, it can peek up, look above terrain. It basically the draw in an intelligence arena is it moves just like a real snake.
Well, it's just like a slinky inside, or what? I don't get it.
Well, it has mechanism, universal joints, and mini motors that have it's segmented throughout its body. There, it's about 6 feet long, and it allows it to move just like you're seeing in the video.
It is so cool. And the front end is a camera, I take it. Is it lens?
Yeah, you got a camera, right? You got a camera, high-res camera in the front. You can feed C4 explosives throughout the body if you needed it to take something out. A lot of different things you can do with that. Obviously, you got to be able to see, so the camera is probably the most important attachment there.
And the camera sends back a signal to somebody working a computer?
Right. The guy is based at a laptop. The controller, it obviously lets him know where he's headed. And as you can see there, you could feed the snake into all kinds of different cracks and different areas that you couldn't otherwise enter with other robots, or not to mention a human being.
Wow,
so in terms of could this be used in Iraq or that sort of thing, a lot of these insurgent strongholds are in disrepair, so you could just have the snake kind of crawling, a crack in the wall and probably have more intelligence than you otherwise would.
Wow, that is amazing. Now, they've been working on this since the 1970s. But, I mean, with our technology and advancement, I assume we're a lot closer to making it happen, right?
Exactly. They've been working on mimicking animal capabilities is what various organizations in Japan, as you mentioned, Bill, they've been working on a robo-dog. The Israelis have been working on a cat that can climb walls, a dog that answers commands. So this is,
a cat that climbs walls?
Yeah, using its claws just like your cat at home. This is another, it has both civil defense.
Well, I think we got the idea, and
How current is that?
yeah, it's a few years old. I think 2013 or 14. It's a few years old. But in no way am I saying that Genesis 49 or this is the fulfillment of Genesis 49. See, I told you now we can all go home. But I just thought it was interesting on. Here is an interesting correlation, and you could do with it what you want. And I'm showing this as I'm kind of snickering here and smiling, that I just thought it was kind of cool. So, and then I just want to, one last idea here while we're wrapping up is, again, I in my mind tie the nation of Israel to the promise to be delivered through Israel to all of the nations. The promise of Abraham, I'm going to bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, and in you, Abraham, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Well, ultimately, that is the one who came is Jesus Christ. And so as we look at these blessings way centuries, millennia before, I tend to look at, well then, how is this correlate to Christ? Because that's how I look at it. So Christ's return, even though it is Christ who will ultimately crush the serpent's head. there was my correlation. Genesis 3:15, when God spoke to Adam, that it's called the proto-evangelium, you know, in the broader term, the first mention of the one who is coming, and proto meaning one. And at the proto-evangelium it states that Christ will crush the serpent's head. Again, the correlating piece being the snake, Genesis 3:15. But there are aspects of hiddenness followed by surprise. Again, the small serpent with the big bite, the spy camera moving with the big bite. You know, the idea that hiddenness followed by surprise connected with the second coming of Christ. There is much talk about that in the New Testament, and the message to the early church was to be ready. You know, that was the idea. So guys, today we took this idea of Dan. We looked at his birth context. We drew from that story, we drew this idea of envy and vindication and that idea as far as, yes, God is on my side. Well, that's one totally isolated idea. But then we went to a whole nother direction, and we talked about the second core idea in the blessing, which is this small to large. I can't find a text in the entire Bible that really definitively supports this idea coming from Dan, but it's certainly true of the nation of Israel within our lifetime. And we looked at that in three ways. We looked at it in two ways. One is politically, it's true. Militarily, it is certainly true. And then finally, last, we tied it into the bigger promise of what is to come through the nation of Israel, blessing all of the nations through Christ. And it is. I see correlation between this and the aspects of the church. Is yes, there's a hiddenness. Be ready. So there's where you're going, gee, boy, he's really on a stretch today. But it is what it is. Have a good week.
It is. Thanks, Mike.